Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. Large organizations can still pull off radical strategic pivots. It may surprise you, but the poster child of disruption, Nokia, provides a great example. Today's guests tell us that the barrier is often raw emotions that flare up after failure and threat, and the way those emotions narrow what leaders can see, say, and seriously consider. Strategy isn't just about cold logic, it's about managing the stress and fear of the bosses. Nokia's story is famous for its fall. It went from dominating mobile handsets to being overtaken quickly by Apple and Android. What gets talked about less is the recovery. From 2013, Nokia made a hard pivot away from phones and into networks and technology infrastructure, eventually becoming an early 5G player. It was a less glamorous path, but it kept the company alive and rebuilt the value. That's where today's guests come in. Their research asks how organizations regulate the emotions of senior leaders while strategy is being made, and how that regulation changes the decisions that follow. They studied Nokia's strategy making from 2007 to 2013 through more than 100 interviews across the company, from upper middle management to executive team and board level. It is a pleasure to welcome back the Nokian scholars, Professor of Strategy at INSEAD, Quy Hui. Welcome back to the show.
It's great to see you again, Aidan.
And Professor of Strategic Management at Aalto University, Timo. Vuori. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Aidan. Great to continue the chat.
I have lots of content coming associated to the knowledge that I've learned from you guys. It was brilliant, and it was so joyful to read this because many of us, even scholars of innovation, think that Nokia is gone. And this shows not only the reinvention of Nokia, but how they did it. But I thought we'd start with the context of this research. When you did it, what was going on in Nokia, the period of time it was, etc. I'd love you to take it away. Maybe Quy, we'll start with you and then come to Timo.
Thank you, Aidan. It is true that once we study an organization, we study on the one stage in their life, usually either from birth to great, or the older stage from great to death, But usually we don't have the privilege to study the whole sequence organization that once can go from birth to great, then great to almost passing out, then passing out back to reasonably healthy again. What fascinates us is this just luck or something else? Or we tend to kind of attribute usually in our strategy literature to the genius of the CEO leader, right? The famous turnaround CEO. That he has so much vision and wisdom that he can hero the organization, Moise, to the desert, leading the tribe to greatness again. And that's the romantic metaphor that we have with management CEOs. And here we have a story that, let's say, much more complex and nuanced. And just to show that CEOs as human management team, as great as they are, they're also human beings. And they live with their fears, anxieties, ambitions, and hopes. And they do not kind of get out of the hole by themselves to their sheer geniuses, or they're so strong like the Japanese samurai, but to the help and assistance of many people who help with their emotions. And I think that's what this story is about, that is fascinating. It's about half this community of help, of people who are from various expertise and various knowledge, helping them. And it took quite a long time. It took 4 years. It's not something that you can do within a few weeks or a few months. Unlike what the psychologists would like to have us believe. So I think that's the big idea, one of the big ideas, that the leadership is as much about the courage and expertise of the CEO as you mentioned team. We always acknowledge that, but it's also as much as contribution of many people whom we know less about.
We talked in a previous episode about how emotions affect strategy making. But in this paper, Timo, you identify three separate places that comes from. One was the government structures, so boards or power centers. The second was advisory structures, analysts, consultants, and internal teams. And then what you call boundary spanning structures like partners or external players. Maybe we'll give context to that. And I just want to let our audience know we're going to go into the Nokia story. It's absolutely fascinating to read the accounts of the interviews that you guys conducted with these informants, as you call them, across the organization, all anonymized. But what's so important is what you said there, Key, is the humanity that comes through, the emotions of a human being here that doesn't want to lose the organization, doesn't want colleagues to lose their jobs, and how that fear absolutely affects their strategy making. But Timo, I'd love you to share these three structures that Kui made reference to, these people that affect the emotions across the organization.
Yeah. So usually when we think of decision makers, emotions, we think of the CEO and the top management team. And in Nokia case, it was really surprising how the people who had built the company and were really attached to the phone business could divest the whole business and pivot into something else, like you said. And if we only look at the top management team dynamics, that would be group level psychology. But it wasn't just about that. So the governance structures was the board of directors, and the board really intentionally designed the strategy process so that emotions wouldn't take over the process. So the chairman told me in an interview how he really considered the emotions and how they had harmed the strategy making in the past. So they wanted to create a process that keeps emotions in check. And that's why that was one of the reasons why the board and the top management team had this super structured process where they looked at data, internalized the data, generated options, evaluated them, but didn't rush into decisions. So the pace of the strategy making process by the top management team was strongly influenced and governed by the board, which helped in emotion regulation. Then the advisory structures were entities like consultants and internal strategy teams that helped top management to see beyond their initial intuitions and emotions. So top management could look at an option and think that this is a bad option, but they would still give it to an analytical team, and the team would analyze that how does it really look like. And once they communicated that actually it looks like this, not how your intuition told, that made the top management emotions also evolve. And finally, the boundary spanning structures refer to customers and potential collaborators. So Nokia had an idea that let's do a new kind of an Android phone with someone. So they actually contacted this third party and created a prototype of a Nokia Android phone. And in this way, really learned could they save the phone business that way. And when they saw the outcome, it helped them realize that this is just like wishful thinking. And so it wasn't this individual or group level master, but really these structures around the top management team that made them have this superhuman emotion regulation capacity in strategy making.
In the article, in the document, in the research that you've done, you created your own structure about how emotions affect strategy making. But what's interesting about it is that people might think that this is linear process, that the arrow of time runs from left to right, but it's iterative. And as you mentioned there, Timo, it comes from many, many different parts of the organization. And I thought I'd just show for those people who are watching us on YouTube, figure 2 from the article, which is socially distributed emotion regulation during strategy making. And it just shows how many angles that this is coming from. And the real thing I really want from our audience to take from it is that this is not a case study of Nokia. This is a case study from how strategy is made in most organizations, and it's a template. And I'd love you to maybe share some of the insights that other organizations can take from that while maybe we're looking at this on the screen.
Aidan, this is in fact our core message. In the sense that when we study one organization, we do try to make it as generalizable as possible by asking the question, what is Nokia a case of? Is it a case of one? Exactly, right? And it is a case of strategy making under high anxiety and high uncertainty, like many organizations are facing today, right? We know that the existing strategy is no longer adequate, but we don't know what exactly we have to move to. We know we have to make more profit, we have to survive, but we don't know exactly what we have to do, right? So that is generalizable from that perspective. I think that need today with AI and all the disruptive technologies is very much salient for many organizations. That's point number one. Point number two, the point that we want to make is that it's okay to be both intelligent cognition, but also emotionally sensitive, right? And do not suppress emotion because it will help you. It will help you if you do it right. Third point, how do you do it right? It's not because you will hire some genius transformational leader or a charismatic leader, okay, or some famous psychologist. It is about how you build up the structure, the collective help in the organization to help you do so, right? And so we're talking about collective help here. It's help from the community, right? And so therefore, emotion is no longer something idiosyncratic or personal, but it is something that you can organize to do so. And any organization who has this kind of insight can do so. I think that's the kind of message of hope we are giving to the people. It's a message of hope. When you read that, is that I can do so. There's nothing that prevents my organization from doing the same thing. There's nothing that prevents my organization to have advisory structures, such as consultants and strategy analysts, to help me. There's nothing to prevent me from having a constructive work relationship with the board. The board will accept both emotions and cognition and work patiently with me, with us. And nothing that prevents me from having boundary structure organization, people who can do project plan experimentation to help me do some prototypes. Okay? This is kind of a message that I think most organizations who are in a reasonable shape can do. And that's how they can do in order to think about what strategy would help them survive and grow in the future, faced with AI disruption and technology disruption and geopolitics and everything else.
And Timo, maybe you'll say a word on the cyclical element of how emotions, because that's the thing that really struck me. What I got most out of it is strategy making is not just based on the structure of an organization, like you would think of something like Conway's Law, where the communication system affects the technological system. But here, it's like Qui and Fury's Law, where the structures of emotions across the organization affect the strategy making, because people feel free to share when things are not going right. They're looking at things with data rather than with emotion. They're letting go of their biases, etc. Maybe we'll share that up front before we start sharing more about the Nokia story.
Yeah. So what I think is really important, besides the elements that we highlighted, is the design of the process, that it brings in the right elements at the right time, so that it enables expressing the emotion and then influencing the emotion and generating the strategy. And for me, maybe it's easiest to give an example. I've done in my consulting work maybe 20 strategy processes based on this model now. So in the early stages, there is the kind of absorption of the external information. So you're kind of just getting everyone on the same page. And in a kind of non-traditional process, you would just look at the information and move on. But in this emotional process, you also reserve a bit time to reflect that what emotions does this trigger in me. So AI is gonna shape our industry. How does it make me feel? And brief discussions already kind of help ease the emotional stress and tension in the process. And you can invite expert outsiders in this part to have the kind of boundary banning structures or the advisory structures to fix misunderstandings and ease fears. In the second state, you typically start generating options. And here again, you intentionally manage the emotional climate that people feel safe to suggest ideas that are maybe good, maybe bad, and people build on them. The classic improv roles that always say yes and this helps the team to see the external trends as opportunities as well and boosts a positive momentum in the process. And in Nokia case, I think this is my favorite. One of the options Nokia created relatively late in the process was this pivot that they ultimately did, buying back NSN. So they initially hated the idea, but because they had this rule that they allow options to come in and start analyzing, they ultimately learned that it's a good one. And then in the third stage, you only start quantitatively more comparing and ranking the options. And this is how you arrive at the choice. But why I'm emphasizing this, that strategy making isn't like a bubble that happens all at the same time, but there are steps. And when you manage those steps also from an emotional perspective, you are more likely to overcome emotional denial and defensiveness and start finding potentially attractive new directions and then build the shared commitment to the new direction.
What I loved about the paper is how it contrasts two different periods. And they're both periods of stress and they're both periods of strategic pressure, major threat. You talk about things like threat rigidity in the paper and how that affects decision making. But it's these two periods, and one period culminated in the CEO being fired, and the other was a new CEO and a new board structure and new strategic challenges as well for the organization, including what you said there, Timo, about letting go of the mobile phone business and leaning into the networks business. I'd love to just share a little bit of the contrast of those two sections from your view as scholars of Nokia.
The first period was from 2007 to 2010. And in that one, Nokia was the top company in the beginning and iPhone was just 1% market share. But in 3 years, the roles were reversed and CEO got fired. And what was still really puzzling to us here was that why they didn't respond to the iPhone in a better way. Like you can find from YouTube these videos that compare Nokia advertisements to real Nokia phones. And the one is fantasy and the other one is like a broken car. So an iPhone was so much better than Nokia phones. And why wasn't Nokia able to recognize this inferiority? And why it held on to the strategy that it had created, even though it was obviously failing. And so that was really puzzling there, and the emotional dynamics have a big role there. In this study then, I think what was the greatest thing that by the second period, so 2012, Nokia leaders had actually realized that it was their emotional denial and kind of attachment to the phone business that prevented them from seeing the reality in those earlier years. And that created the desire or motivation to regulate and manage emotions. So they got cancer in 2007. They refused to believe it. Well, then they were barely saved. And then next time they went to the doctor early and took the treatments.
I would like to add to what Timo said in the following sense. I said that the second period might not have happened as smoothly as it was without the first period, where people have to experience a failure, right? Take this sort of effect of trying to go fast, to have a limited appraisal of various options, much more narrow in the various options, and moving more on the defensive, trying to defend your own strategy and trying to keep it well. And because of that failure, that ultimately resulted, I think that prepared the ground for people to be more receptive to behaviors that are quite unconventional for most business executives, right? So in the second stage, the board almost like encourage, the top management team to be more calm, more calm and less panicky and to be less defensive. And it's okay, to fail. It's okay to look at options. Take your time, right?
The board even had this specific slide. So the CEO had to present to the board every time they met a slide that was entitled "What Keeps Me Up at Night." So the board really wanted the CEO to share the worries and fears through this very concrete practice. So, and that was really unconventional. You would usually want the CEO to be confident and give faith and direction, but they wanted that, hey, what's worrying you and what could go wrong?
And also in terms of emotion, and in the sense they distinguish two types of emotion. One is the emotional impulses, because we all have emotions, right? And the first thing is that how would we react to our emotions, which are our emotional impulses. And most people naturally would act on the emotional impulses, even thinking wrongly that that's the intuition. I had great intuition, but because I had so much experience in managing in the past, so my emotional impulses, which are my intuition, must be great, right? But I think they were able to question it and revisit that assumption, right? And so the idea of emotional impulses, acting on your emotional impulses, becomes gradually an act of let's be patient and understand what's driving our emotions, and what's driving them, and can it be otherwise, which is a simple English for emotional regulation.
I came across a quote and I had to share. It's from The Beauties of Nature and the Wonders of the World We Live in by an author called John Lubbock. It says, "What we see depends mainly on what we look for. In the same field, the farmer will notice the crop, the geologist, the fossils, the botanist, the flowers, the artist, the coloring, the sportman, the cover for the game. Though we may all look at the same things, it does not all follow that we all see the same things." And you show that emotional regulation shapes the framing of strategic issues. Organizational practices, structures, and processes influence which information leaders pay attention to. And the information that they see is more likely to influence their cognition than the information they do not see. I thought that was just such an important point that I wanted to highlight, because we've all been through this. You're in a moment of stress. You don't see something staring in the face, or maybe you're not activated to see that. We had an episode a few weeks ago with Gary Klein called "Seeing What Others Don't," and what he talked about was the critical importance of having an outside voice to activate you, because you may not actually just be aware of something, and when you're aware of it, you'll start to see it. And I just thought we'd share a little bit on that, because that became ultimately clear to me, the importance of that in this Nokia journey.
Exactly, and the importance for that how we teach to the new generation of executives, and I paraphrase what you just said, Aidan, by saying, what you feel will influence what you see, and if you change the way you feel, you will change the way you see.
And I think there are two levels. So one is this self-awareness. So you recognized, or I make myself see in a new way, or I make myself feel in a new way. So self-regulation. So if I'm stressed, I go for a run and then I see the issues in a different way. And then in this paper, what we really highlight is the structured mechanisms for emotion regulation. So the board practice of having this structured process, it forced the top management to constantly look at the same topics from new angles. So the poem you read was a kind of perfect metaphor for that. So they had McKinsey and BCG analyzing the same option for them so that they would see the same meadow in two different ways. And they repeated that multiple times. So they really again wanted to understand it fully. And then that full understanding reduced the myopic emotional reaction and impulse. But the point is that usually the willpower alone is not enough. So you cannot regulate your own emotion and bias just by your own mental strength. You need others to help you do that.
I also want to add something, because I think you asked us that question before about the recursivity of the process, right? And that's what Timo just said, is one illustration of that, meaning that, that the consulting firms that are highly intelligent, or at least highly credible at that time, were coming up with some scenarios options, but the top management and the board do not just happy with the first iteration, right? They said, okay, why don't you, we have a monthly discussion. We still have a lot of emotions about this issue. Why don't you guys go back and do a second analysis and show us what you have, right? And then they would analyze it again, and the recursive process, but it's not good enough. Why don't we pay you to go back again to do a third time, the analysis? So that's the recursivity, and each time new elements come up, right? And the new elements come up, gradually would, let's say, reinforce that maybe what's emerging is fairly robust. It's robust in the sense that we have looked at various options and it's getting stabilized, right? Stabilized. No, it's not like the one way, one analysis will come up with one option, the analysis come up with completely different option. Then doesn't make any sense. That third is completely different. That way, it's not a stable option, right? Then that doesn't give you a lot of security in your strategy, right? Given the options, given the resources and the conditions and constraints that you have, right?
One of the things I wanted to point out as well, and we often don't have the language to be able to express these things. And this is the thing I love about doing the show, is learning a language to do this. So people might not call it this, but this is what they experience, because you tell us in the paper, emotion regulation can occur through antecedent focused or response focused mechanisms. And I'd love to share the difference between those both, because they both have an effect on you and they both affect how strategy happens. And it's a really important thing, I think, for people who are involved in organizations over long periods of time. They need to understand the difference of this, because also if you're a newcomer to an organization and you may look at somebody who's been there for a long period of time, they may have experienced things differently from you because they've been there and they've lived through a period of crisis or threat, and it affects how they show up in the organization.
So the distinction between antecedent and response focused is that in antecedent focused emotion regulation, you modify the emotional reaction before it happens. So a simple example might be that if you are going to, well, I will give a super example. So if you are on a diet and you kind of know that when you go to the store, you will have a really strong impulse to buy candy when you walk next to the candy shelves. So an antecedent focused emotion regulation is that you intentionally take a detour and avoid seeing the candy, or you close your eyes when you walk the aisle, or you remind yourself that I want to live longer, so I hate candy. So that way you don't feel the pull from the candy. While then response focused emotion regulation is what you do after the emotional reaction happens. So you have seen the candy, you want it, but then you slap yourself in the face and say, I don't take it, I don't take it. And then you struggle with yourself. And then when we take this analogy to organization level, so it could be related to how you analyze the different strategic options. So if you have a very structured template for analyzing an option that, let's say we divest this business, you can intentionally look at what's the long-term impact on our profitability and how many people will die when we do this and so on. So you pay attention to the kind of information that doesn't trigger panic you immediately. But if you don't have the template, you just see, we lose this business, we become smaller, we are failures, and that makes you upset. So you intentionally focus attention on elements that give you the kind of more stable perspective in an emotional sense. And then, of course, the response focused regulation would be that, okay, I feel horrible about this, but I ignore my emotions and do it the other way around. And actually want to say this. So one from another company, a leader said, in these moments, there is no room for emotions. And that's how we often think. But this phrase itself shows a kind of appreciation that emotions become highly salient in decisions and that you have to use willpower to push them away. But that's response-focused emotion regulation, which is kind of the most elementary form of regulating them.
I wanted to share a little bit about period one. So period one that you studied, this is where They clung very tightly to the old strategy, the Symbian strategy, the operating system that they had. This was very much mobile focused, an overinvestment in phone manufacturing, etc. And you have lots and lots of quotes from different people. And this is from a top manager, number 7, TM7, top manager 7. And he said that, or he or she said, a lot of the members of the board 1, that is, the previous board, felt that they weren't always encouraged to speak freely. And a leading board member had a very authoritarian style, even to the point that he had a gavel in the boardroom. That's, for those who don't know what that is, it's what the judge uses to call order in court. And it was a symbol of the tradition and formality that, and also the intimidating culture that was in that board. And the board maintained throughout that period its denial of the severity of the situation of the mobile phone business, the growing threat that was coming now from the US, and the fact that they didn't have much of a US strategy. They were leaning on the time, I know this from the previous episodes we did with Jackie McNish, they were working with BlackBerry. BlackBerry were leading down the garden path, and it was a mess. But the culture didn't allow them to call that out.
And I think there is important distinction here. One is this like formal climate and the interpersonal fears, or so whether you are allowed to challenge the chairperson or not, or do you have psychological safety, so the open discussion culture. And I think in Nokia's case, there was this hierarchical fear of speaking up, and that was problematic. And then the second layer of emotion was the attachment to the business content. So every Nokia leader really wanted to have Nokia phones succeed. And for each of them, it was really difficult to acknowledge that the phones are not good. So 2 levels of pain. One is that I see the errors and admit the errors. And then another fear is that, am I allowed to tell you about the errors? And I think this interpersonal fear part came in because every one of them was really upset about the failure of the phone business. So it made every one of them feel bad that the phones are not doing well. And then speaking about it triggered those negative emotions.
Another quote that will just give us a final touch on what it was like in period 1 and with board 1, that this is one of the top managers who presented to this board. And he or she said, we didn't really have a long deep dive in strategy before mid-2012. Top managers' strategy presentations to the board at Nokia were always very razzle dazzle and not enough facts, figures, and hard decisions. It was always kind of a show. It was not what I would call a proper discussion. The way we shared with board 1 was always a little too high level. And that comes through when you contrast it to period 2, because in period 2, it was very much data driven, but also, as you tell us, it was very much outside driven. So it wasn't just this myopic internal view of things. It was outside, constantly putting pressure on that, pressure testing ideas, getting them out into the wild to see how they would actually float out there. But let's just contrast period 1, because that whole insular way of seeing things, or not seeing things actually, because as you say, they were kind of blinkered in that first period.
It's dependent on 2 factors. So one was that the top management, they knew that if they bring up problems, some members of the board will be really hostile toward them due to the emotional dynamics we just spoke. So they prefer to not be yelled at, which is understandable. And then the second element is that the board at that time didn't have such competencies that they could have really kind of challenged the underlying assumptions in the top management team presentations. And you have to remember that this was a very disruptive time. So Nokia still had like 35% market share, but the digital platforms were just emerging and growing. And software had just become highly important, and software was really new to Nokia. So when a top manager went to the board and said that, hey, our software looks great and it looks like the software industry is growing really fast, so we will have this hockey stick growth curve, so it's going to be fantastic, then it was easy for the board to say that, hey, that sounds great. But had they had the top management could have had the courage to say that actually our solution is kind of patched up and doesn't necessarily integrate that well, and we would need to do more work on that. But I guess they felt that that would trigger a negative reaction from the board. And then on the other hand, the board wasn't able to ask those questions. So they bought, was it this music service for 200 million or whatever? And then if the top management would say that it might actually not fit integrate well, that you just wouldn't have a kind of constructive conversation. But the board didn't understand the technical detail enough so that it would challenge them. And one anecdote still here, I don't remember if I said this earlier, but it was only in one of those board meetings later on when they learned that one of the new board members who had software understanding, he asked something about the Symbian operating system. And then the top manager said that I just learned this yesterday myself, but the compilation process takes 48 hours when it should take 15 minutes. So when you write software code, you have to compile it before you can execute it, so test it out. And normally that takes 15 minutes, but Nokia's software was so messy that it took 2 days. So that's why all innovation in the software development was impossible. But they learned about this only like after 5 years of problems.
That escalation of commitment was evident throughout. You said here, so this is again a manager, one of the interviews you had, they said that we drove the Windows strategy like dogs without any plan B in our minds. Whenever there was a bump in the road, we set about solving it as if we had no other options. Emotionally, we were committed to it, but it didn't make sense. And as in the past, top managers saw information that made them doubt the viability of their current strategy, but the unpleasant emotions that were triggered in them avoided them from sharing it to the rest of the organization. One of the personal anecdotes I had at the time, I was working in a media company and we got paid by Nokia to develop apps for Nokia. But the problem with the App Store was that they were doing this to now I can see from the inside what they were doing. They were doing this to prop up the store and the strategy versus what was happening with Apple is you were going and developing apps yourself at your own dime to be in the App Store because it was the place to be. It was like the cool party that everybody was hanging out while Nokia were paying it to come to their party. And that avoidance of inevitable decline is something that we see time and time again. And I wondered what your feelings were about that, because this is something startups feel all the time where they're buying audience, maybe they're buying users, they're giving away these discounts to prop up what looks like their strategy working, so they have to avoid those awkward board meetings versus calling it early and saying, look, this isn't working, we're not doing something right. But without, as you said, Timo, psychological safety, it's very difficult to do that.
I think we have talked too much about the idea of psycho safety as if it's a panacea. But the fact of the matter is that, we have been trying this idea for 30 years and it looks easy in paper, but extremely difficult to implement in practice. As Timo was sharing his experiences today in his consulting work, I did the same, and I just had interviews with major companies just last week, in various across the world, from all the way between China and the UK. And then I saw the same phenomena. It's the same phenomena of, I would call that self-censored speeches, at all the levels, But when I interviewed these managers, they talk so much openly and honestly, like we did in Nokia. And then in the end, I said, why didn't you tell what you told me to your bosses or to ever you try, And they said, Professor, but they will not want to listen anyway. So why should I bother? So I am struck by how widespread this one is today, not yet have today, all across the world. So that it has no industry differences, nor national cultural differences.
We see it at a political level. We won't go there, but it's everywhere.
You see that in broad daylight, right? Yeah. Anyway, so it looks like safety as something that we hide behind is something that is panacea, but it doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah, so we are really good at kind of misleading or lying to ourselves as well. So I want to succeed in this. I train in a specific way, and there are warning signals, but I ignore them, like the quote of the Nokia manager, and keep going. But I don't remember if this made it to the paper, but actually one practice that Nokia had in that time was to counter against this bias in 2012. So they, instead of relying on kind of real-time assessment, is this good enough for retrospectively looking at are we seeing warning signals, they decided in advance that if we fail to reach this level of performance, then we revise the strategy. And if our outcomes are below this level, then we do a completely new strategy. And I think that has been one of the most important lessons for me for like self-management in this paper, that you in advance you determine how do I know when I'm failing. So what's the indicator? So then when you get that data, then it's really difficult to rationalize it away. Oh yeah, in the paper it's the quote that the top manager says that they had defined the sales targets for the latest and greatest phone model in 2012. And then when they didn't meet those targets, they knew that it was agreed beforehand. So they started the process for renewal. But the fact that they had agreed that was important because, as the top manager said, you could have always said that, well, it's the next model that will turn around this business or the one after that. So you can always say that the next one will be successful. And then in the startup context, I think that's why the lean startup methodology and these are successful is this that you design experiments and if you do it well, you define the parameters that you have to reach in order to continue versus pivot. So for any startup, I always teach this that for any strategy team that you on the kind of hypothesis and I wouldn't say they are targets, but they are interpretations of the results in advance. So if the value of the variable is above this line, we do that. If it's below, we do something else.
In our paper, I think it's one very short sentence, but it means a lot to us, and it's about the systematic exploration of failures, right? It started with the sentence, what if we fail, right? In our paper, we wrote that. And then it's a pretty bad thing to say. You don't want to spread that you are a negative thinker, but we must talk systematically all the ways in which you could fail and think about it ahead of things that what if we fail, what will we do next? And I think something there that is maybe a more practical implementation of psycho safety, is to make the discussion of failure a systematic and routinized procedure. I want to relate to that to a quote that got my attention this week in the BBC talking about the story of one woman executive's memory of her father, right? I don't know her lady's name anymore, but what she described caught my attention. They said she always her father because of her dinner table every week. She asked her, Gang, how did you feel this week? How did you feel this week? And what can we learn about it? I don't want you to talk about success. How did you feel this week? I think that's a fairly cool, every week, dinner table. How did you feel this week? I think today would be a little weird to talk about like this with your children, isn't it? What do you mean?
Yeah, but it normalizes it, doesn't it? I mean, I think that's the big.
I think is he credited to her father's memory.
It's a very important thing. And Timo, what you were talking about there is associated a lot with startups, but it's even harder to kill something in an organization where maybe you feel that failure is associated to you. So to have some type of kill criteria is really important. And one of the things that I've experienced this myself, and many of our audience I'm sure has, is that sometimes the organizational leaders and maybe the board will keep a receipt and go, Aidan failed, not the project failed, and not associated to a Key's point about the fact that, well, I was brave enough to actually try this thing in the first place. You should celebrate that, not the fact that it didn't work, because it was a good insight. We backed it. I failed cheaply. We didn't overinvest in it, and I was able to actually kill it cheaply. That is something you see in this Nokia story. But one of the things I wanted to point to was the shift in the board, and in particular the new chairman that was appointed in 2012. And you don't say that this person was pivotal in the change. He was just a part of that change. And I found this very interesting, that just like the Nokia change, we probably didn't see the parallel here, but something similar happened in Microsoft where Satya Nadella joined. The board were very dog eat dog, very aggressive board, and they spoke not very politely to each other. And he bought everybody a copy of Nonviolent Communication, that Marshall, I can't remember the name. I have the book there somewhere. You know the book. Anyway, so they bought a copy he bought a copy for everybody in the board, and it was a symbol of, we're not going to do that anymore. But this chairman did something similar, and if somebody berated a colleague, he would go up and talk to him and go, don't do that again. And really interestingly, then that board member had to come in at a later date and apologize in front of everybody to that colleague and say, I'm sorry for speaking to you like that. And those little changes, those public displays of this is not the way we're going to do things anymore, had a dramatic effect in the organization.
Yeah, and they were symbolically important. So the chairman shared the golden rules of the board work in Twitter, and he had rules like bad news is good news is no news, and no news is bad news. So he really kind of every day communicated the importance of open communication, and it came from his experience in the board when he saw that he wasn't able to raise the concerns and he didn't get the relevant information. So he really wanted to work on that. So they really worked on the board and board top management team culture, and they removed the interpersonal fears. So they removed all kind of unnecessary sources of pain, because the business issues were in themselves extremely painful and they had to deal with that pain. So if they would also have this interpersonal pain there, then you would have just two huge sources of pain, and that would be too much. So they first removed the one that they could control, so how they behaved with one another. And only after that, they started talking about the painful business situation. And I think many of the board members were really explicit about this, facing that first they built a good atmosphere and then they talk about the difficult issues. But it's just, you have some limit in the capacity of how much pain you can tolerate. And then you have to, I think we speak about digestible pieces or chunks in the paper, that you have to split the pain into small enough pieces in order to process it.
There was another interesting thing, and you talked about the symbolic element of the apology, but there was another thing they did, and I'm sure you're proponents of this in your own strategy work, which is calling out the bad news. And this is a board member here who is quoted as saying, at some point I spoke up to the CEO and said, we have to put the cat on the table, which is, as you know, Timo, a Finnish way of referring to the elephant in the room. And the CEO said that in Canada, the expression is put the moose on the table. And this board member said, well, that's actually more relevant given the size of the problem, because it's a moose, not a cat, after all. And they all laugh.
And like we discussed earlier, it really normalized this information sharing, that it wasn't personal failure anymore that you told that something is not going well, but it was service for everyone, that, hey, this is one piece of the puzzle that we need in order to save the company.
There was another thing you said, Timo, there about the idea of sharing scenarios became commonplace. And this is where the whole move to networks, maybe we'll move to that now. This is where it came up because they started to share these scenarios, even if the scenarios were unpleasant or weren't very exciting. And this is one of the things they're like on, oh, the networks business is boring and getting away from telcos as our identity. And the real kind of dilemma there, the real pain of dragging away from something that was core to their identity as Nokia and moving towards the networks business, because that was initially rejected and it was rejected time and time again. And this is where the data came in and said, actually, it mightn't be a bad thing. Selling off the mobile phone business might be the right move.
So the network business had been formed in 2007 with Nokia and Siemens joint venture, and Nokia board had essentially tried to divest it ever since then. So they felt it was a bad business. And if I remember correctly, they had even a private equity firm said that if Nokia pays 1 million, the private investor can take the business and manage it. And then the CFO in 2012 suggested that, hey, let's buy this back. And as many of the interviewees told, the first reactions were not positive in that meeting, but they had the rule that whenever an option comes up, we start analyzing the option. And then they started learning after a few iterations that it actually could be a very positive direction. But the more fundamental point is this, that they really wanted to create many options and keep many options alive. And I think it was the chairman who said that they intentionally did it also because having multiple options reduces emotional attachment to the current strategy. So when you know that you could go that direction or that direction or that direction, you don't have to hold on to what you are doing now. So it makes the change or renewal feel, I guess, more manageable. And I think that relates to also what Kui was saying about the failure scenarios. So when they were imagining that what bad could happen and how it would hurt us and how we would then deal with it, thinking about the negative stuff actually removed fear about it because they were more prepared. So it wasn't scary anymore because they knew what's the next step after that. And this thinking in options, that's another important lesson here, that you always have more options than you realize in a difficult situation. And if you pause and consider those options, you get a higher sense of control, and that again iteratively helps you create even more options and reach a better outcome.
I think this is technique now we are using when advising many executives. I'm sure Timo do the same thing. And in order that we always ask questions, they always come with almost insurmountable challenges. And we say, okay, so let's go down and let's look at the situation and let's come up with 3 options. Let's come up with almost 3 crazy options, whatever you have. And let's look at one by one. So then people start to cool down, as Timo said, because people don't feel stuck with one option, because they always feel stuck with one option that they see there's no way out. But you look, that life's always an option. So we have 3 options, and then your imagination start to work.
It all comes back to the emotions as well. Like if you're in a state of crisis or we've all had this experience, you've lost your keys and you're in a rush to go to a board meeting or something, you can't find your keys anywhere. The more stressed you are, the less you're going to find those keys. And you're better off actually sitting there and taking a few deep breaths. I teach my kids this. I've kids now, teenagers, and they both do sport. And I teach them that if you get into an emotional state on the pitch or in the ring, one of them's an MMA fighter, I said, like, you're toast, because you're going to make terrible decisions. And you're better off training your emotional control, because actually you're going to see things clearer as well. And it's the exact same. This is what all comes through here, is that this is what I was saying. It feels like that law, Conway's law, but applied to emotion. because structure shapes communication, but it also shapes what people feel safe to think. And that ultimately determines how strategy emerges and what you see and what options you see, etc., etc. I wondered what your final thoughts were for an organization. If you're to go, hey, I wrote this paper, I studied Nokia for a long time. Here's the main thing I want you to take from it. What would be that for each of you, gents? Maybe Kui would start with you.
I would say that even today, based on what I saw, executives doing strategy put too much emphasis on an attention on what I call the conventional, rational, logical elements. Do I have the right structure in place? Do I have the right strategy? Do I have the right incentives? Whether they are alignment, do they have alignment? Is my communication clear? So all of which are necessary but incomplete and will not lead to success. So what's missing and complements the cognitive logic aspects, which most company executives can do very well with the help of consulting firms, right? But the collective awareness and paying attention to the collective emotion, not personal emotion, but collective emotion, that would influence how the collectively thinks about strategy making and execution is seriously deficient, and most people bypass it and they just pay lip service via some Gallup poll measures like employee engagement. But employee engagement is a very, very limiting proxy for having strategy success and whether you are implementing the right strategy in the first place.
Great stuff, Kui. And we'll come to you, Timo. One of the things, though, I have to say to you, Kui, I hate to see, and you see this sometimes, you see people who play it safe, who are yes men and women, who just say what the boss wants to say. But when you see them succeed, it sickens me. And ultimately, I'm sure it leads to the death of the organization because you're not hearing the truth the whole time. But I have to say, I find it hard to stomach.
Yeah, we see it very often. I still with we see like Timo, you and I, we see today, despite all the lessons from the past, we see that repeating with amazing regularity. And my take on it, I tell you that you guys, you can take risk and you can fail, and but you get most of the time you get the golden handcuff. You go the golden parachute. But think about how your underperformance will impact the welfare of thousands of employees and their families which do not have the golden parachute.
You said to me before we came on air, it made me think of the Titanic in Belfast. I'm living here in Ireland and up in Belfast. It had such a dramatic effect on the community. It devastated people because they were so proud of this. And it was the same for Nokia, so proud of this business. You talked to me as a Canadian, Kui, about how you lost BlackBerry and you lost other organizations and the effect it has on people. It has an emotional effect on a country as well. And Nokia haven't become a $1 trillion business as well.
Yeah. Nokia is doing fine in the networks business. Not like super successful, but still one of the three global players with Huawei and Ericsson. So most likely our conversation is going through Nokia networks as well. And in terms of Finland, I think it is really storing all the emotion related to Nokia's success. It's kind of warm memory already. There is nostalgia. So a few years ago, there was negative emotion that all the Nokia people were really losers. And before that, they were heroes. So if you had a Nokia business card, even a middle manager, you could have a meeting with the prime minister on a short notice because Nokia was so great. But now this new level is this nostalgia. So even my university, there is this Nokia design archive where there are different kind of Nokia phones and sketches, and like the university is really proud of. It's like a mausoleum or something. So there is this nostalgia in it, but it's also inspiring. I think people are looking forward, and there is this. It sets an aspiration level that new startups know of the possibility of being one of the world's most valuable brands. I think Nokia was second most valuable at some point. So it has left this aspiration level. And then we have something like Angry Birds and this kind of, or this ICEYE, the satellite company that is now selling satellites to every European army. And so there are these aspirations. So I think the overall impact has been good.
Just because you've said that, it just reminded me of this book we covered a couple of weeks ago, Losing the Signal, about BlackBerry, was that you see the other side of Nokia as well, where Nokia had tried things, like they tried the App Store, they tried to sell ringtones through their networks, but it was the mobile phone carriers that were blocking them all the time. And then the mobile phone carriers allowed Apple to do it because Steve Jobs did a deal with Singular. And that was something they had tried. So there's empathy here when you see both sides of the story, because you hear these stories. Initially, the story of Nokia is like they were so blind, they were arrogant, etc. They stopped listening to the future. But when you see these stories from different angles, you can put yourself in the seat and you can go, that could have easily happened to me. And I think that's, for me, one of the most important lessons of sharing these things, is that you put yourself in there, and it's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. It's hard to see these things when it's you in the hot seat. And that's what the importance of this work is, massively important.
I have been now for over 10 years having senior executive coaching on strategy execution. And I always teaching the case of Nokia, and then they use the analysis of emotional analysis. And then the conclusion for most executives, which I think is the way I want to take them to, is exactly the point you just made. I said, that Nokia in the end is us, it's our companies, and all the people in the room agreed. From China to that one, it's that nobody has a sense of we are better than Nokia. Nobody, even today who survey may say, that anybody in that situation, in that context, given the set of conditions that we're facing them, is likely to do the same thing. We are driven by emotional impulses, habits, strategy. We'll be able to say, So in the sense that I said, most of the time, when they do the analysis of the old strategy, we said, professors, we are Nokia. Today, Nokia still exists in people's organization.
Well said, well said. And Timo, I was going to come to you just for your final word. If you were going to give people advice in the lift and you had very little time, based on this work that you've done, and I know you've written another paper which we'll perhaps cover in the future with Michael Tushman, what would you say to people? What would be your piece of advice based on everything you've studied?
If you want to make successful strategy, you need to make realistic assumptions. And one of the assumptions is that people have emotions. So when you design your strategy, making process and the actual strategy factor in the emotional dynamics. Otherwise, it's based on false assumptions and it will fail.
Fantastic. And I'll share where to find both of you. I'll share links to your LinkedIn profiles where I know you share some content as well. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you guys, and thank you for these deep dives into your work. It's been a pleasure. Professor of Strategy at INSEAD, Kui Hui, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. It's an honor to be on your show.
And Professor of Strategic Management at Aalto University, Timo Vuori, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Aidan, and thanks, Kui. It has been really fun to talk about the paper.
Thanks, guys. Brilliant. I'll press stop.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com.